All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm Vice President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, or ITIF. For those of you that don't know ITIF, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focused on the intersection of technology, innovation, and public policy. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Malvertising, How Piracy Sites Use Malicious Ads to Infect Consumer Devices with Malware. So we know online piracy costs the American economy and American workers billions of dollars every year. But the pain doesn't just stop there. These piracy sites are now distributing malware that exposes consumers to all sorts of threats, including ransomware, through the malicious ads that they're distributing on there. And that creates new cybersecurity risks, not only for consumers, but also cybersecurity risks that affect our national security. So the purpose of today's event is to really discuss the nature of these threats, the ways in which bad actors are using these unscrupulous ad networks to distribute malware, and then the steps that we can take to address these threats. So first, thanks to all of you who are joining us in the room. Also, thanks to those of you who are joining us through the live stream. If you're watching in the room, we are going to have time for Q&A with the panel. Just raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you. If you're watching online, there is a link to Slido that you can click. If you're on the ITIF website, it's just below the video. If you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook, you can see the link in the video description. We hope to have Senator Tillis join us today. He is caught up right now in some other meetings, so he may be able to join us towards the end, but we'll certainly pause when and if he gets here. Senator Tillis, of course, has been a leader on these issues, and so we really thank him for his involvement in these issues. But to kick off this discussion, I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. Starting on my far left, we have Shaun Gallagher, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Unit 221B, a cybersecurity firm. We have Tom Galvin, the Executive Director of the Digital Citizens Alliance, a consumer advocacy group focused on building a safer internet. And then to my right, Shaun Tews, non-resident senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute with a deep background on all things tech policy, but especially cybersecurity. So first of all, thanks to all of you for being here today. But to kick us off, Tom, Digital Citizens Alliance recently published this great report called The Unholy Triangle, where you found that users who visit piracy sites are being served up all these malicious ads, and they use scare tactics to trick them into downloading malware. So first of all, can you tell us what exactly this unholy triangle is, and then tell us a little bit more about what you found in this research?
Sure, Daniel. Sure, Daniel. First off, thank you to ITIF and Daniel for your leadership and the work you do. ITIF does a remarkable job of looking at issues that affect technology and innovation in other areas of society, and they're prolific in the work they do and really insightful, so thank you, Daniel. Two, let me thank Senator Tillis and his staff for their leadership and their willingness to host this event. That is greatly appreciated. I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us remotely and give an extra special star to everyone who is in DC, weathering lots of different events and security and everything else. We're going to give you free Twitter accounts to all of you as a thank you. So to Daniel's point, the report we did called Unholy Triangle really looks at how piracy has changed, more importantly, how the threats have changed. For a long time, all of us have seen piracy for a long time. It used to be ripping DVDs and everything else. But as it became digital, it evolved. So back in the old days, piracy was a profound issue and an impactful issue for a narrower set of people, mostly content creators who didn't appreciate the fact their work was being ripped off and they weren't being compensated for it. But as the world went digital, from streaming and websites and everything else, criminals did what criminals do. They found other opportunities to make money, to harm people along the way, if that's what it took to make money. And it has, in many respects, expanded beyond an issue for creators, and frankly, even beyond an issue for consumers, to now having implications that are law enforcement, national security, and otherwise. But it starts with someone being baited or lured to a piracy site in hopes of getting something. I'm going to walk through that in a little bit on slides. I hope everyone can see them. So just to put this in context, Piracy is a $2 billion plus annual illegal market, broken nearly evenly between subscription revenues and advertising revenue models. So think of that as if you have Netflix and you pay a subscription, you're not necessarily seeing ads. And if you have an ad-based system, you're seeing ads as an exchange for you being able to see the services, but you're not paying a subscription. Piracy falls very much along the same way with over $2 billion in that. So piracy operators realize they can make additional millions by exposing the users of their sites to malware. And they do it in concert with criminals and malvertisers. And malvertisers are those who are willing to serve up advertisements that when you click on them include malicious code that end up infecting your computer and doing lots of other things. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So what our report found, and I'm going to stop here and talk about the fact this was not just a DCA report, this was a report done by Unit 221B, and Shaun is representing them here, and White Bullet. And a lot of the security stuff we're going to show was actually overseen by Shaun, and he's going to go into that in the panel in terms of what that is. So one of the things we found was that the pirates are making about $121 million in additional revenue from ads that contain malware, and we'll walk through how that works. And they are assisted by those in the ad ecosystem, including those with ties to Russia. Shaun will walk through it, but most of their communications with the people we dealt with were in Russian along the way. And what that comes down to, and why we called it an unholy triangle, is it essentially comes down to this. Malvertisers, those who want to peddle malicious ads, pay money to pirates, the $121 million. And they do that because they know internet users will go visit piracy sites, and they'll be lured into clicking on ads, and we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. And when they do that, in what is effectively social engineering to convince them to not only click on the ads out of fear or desire, but also to condition them to perhaps lower their security settings to get what they want, it ultimately leads to malware that goes to internet users. It's incredibly lucrative. It's bad for consumers. It's bad for small businesses, and it's increasingly dangerous for corporations and government entities, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So at the center of this are the ad intermediaries we talked about. So how do they do it? They do it through a combination of fear. So you're on a piracy site and you get an ad that serves up that says your computer is infected. Of course, that ad doesn't know it because it's a static ad. But if you can trick enough users into thinking that and clicking on the ad designed to say, I can help you protect you, is actually going to have malware and hurt you. Two, it might offer you a service, like something that helps you organize your pictures. Or three, it might give you access to a movie, like you see there for Game of Thrones. So it's relying on a bit, like I said, it's trying to bait people through both fear, you're in trouble, or here's something you might want. And it's based on deception. This ad, which was created by Shaun's team, is an ad that says your computer's infected. You see the scare tactic, it says you're infected, and then it has a Microsoft barcode that essentially makes it seem like, oh, this must be okay because it must be from Microsoft. This was an ad that Shaun's team created. And then they pitched it to ad members of the ad ecosystem to see what would happen. And they said, sure, we'll publish this, and we'll put this out there, designed to deceive people so that they can infect them with malware. So we all know about malware, and we know that ransomware is a significant issue. One of the things that we found in the course of doing this work, and of course this was in a contained laboratory environment, was as we clicked on these ads, we were the subject of a ransomware attack. This is actually the attack, and we actually have it all filmed for anybody who would like that. But you have this special offer. That special offer in the middle is the bait. Then you get asked to click on something to get it. After you click on it, your computer shuts down, and it's kind of an eye chart here, but these files are all encrypted. So within a couple minutes, everything on your computer, all the data and all the files on your computer are now encrypted, and you don't have any access to them. And then you get an email that says, hey, all your files are encrypted. If you want them back, if you want a key to open them up again, you have to pay us money. In this case, $980, including an offer to say, you only have to pay $490 if you do it in the next 72 hours. There's a really specific reason for that. They know if they move quick, you can't go to law enforcement. So they get their money and they move on. This doesn't mean you'll get all your files back. It also doesn't mean they won't share your files with other people. But this is something specific we were subject to, and Shaun's team saw it on multiple sites as they did it. So one of the components of this is that piracy is dangerous for users and funds criminals to the tunes of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's dangerous for users and it funds criminals. Is that it? It's not. Unfortunately, criminals are clever and they've learned other ways to be able to do things. For example, each of us, when we're on a we're on our computer at home, we're on a residential IP. And on piracy sites, whether they're telling you or not, they might essentially give someone else access to your IP connection. Residential IP connections are valuable because they tend to go under the radar screen of law enforcement. So let's imagine they go and do something nefarious, and they've now been able to go under the radar a bit. But let's say they don't go under the radar and they get caught. Whose door do you think they knock on? It's your door because they think it's your IP address. So that's thwarting law enforcement in their ability to do that. The second thing is there's a Hezbollah station called El Manar, which was designated a terrorist entity several years ago. We are finding this station, which promotes jihad and recruits, on about 50% of piracy streaming services. So it becomes a means by which to circumvent a ban on terrorist activity in the United States or terrorist propaganda in the United States. So we've moved past consumers to now having law enforcement and national security issues. And as we move to a more hybrid workplace, which obviously the pandemic has been a catalyst for it, we're now seeing issues not only from a small business standpoint, but a corporate standpoint, but the Department of, potentially federal entities, including those with sensitive information. So if you work at the Pentagon, say, and you have a son or daughter in the basement on a piracy site, or you go to a piracy site, now it's just a question of how good your security is and whether they can condition you to reduce your security, because it is effectively a game of social engineering. That is the risk we now face. This is no longer just about a profound impact on creators, and it's no longer about a hassle and a danger for consumers. It has expanded to lots of different areas. So that was the basis of the work we did. I truly appreciate the partnership that White Bullet and Unit 221B have done in this. We're now looking at other research as we do it, but wanted to walk through this, and I'll turn it back over.
Great. Thanks so much for that overview, Thom. And again, I think it's a great report, so I encourage everyone to take a look at the full details. But Shaun, I want to bring you in on this since you did, some of this research. Just kind of starting off, ransomware is obviously one of the most serious threats that both businesses and consumers face. Can you kind of walk us through, what you're seeing with these attacks and what you found that was unique in this particular research?
Sure. So basically, what we did is we started looking at piracy sites. And if anyone, I'm sure no one on this room has ever been on a piracy website. But if you had been, you might have noticed a lot of ads coming up and thought no one would ever click on that. So we went and we clicked on it to see what would happen. And while you're thinking no one would ever click on that, maybe that's you, but of the thousands of people visiting that site, it only takes a couple people for this to be worth their while. So we go and we click on these different ads, and what we see is links to, as Thom showed, file downloads, masquerading as video players, masquerading as Chrome extensions that you need to install to play the video. And when you go ahead and you download those files, that's where you get hit by a ransomware attack. And the interesting part is that these piracy sites are kind of all, they seem unique, like they're kind of, somebody spun it up out of their basement. And it's pretty like slapdash and, not super like structured. But what's actually backing those sites is a pretty, sophisticated network of ad distribution that people can tap into to make money off of their homegrown pirate site. So those larger ad distribution networks are what are actually being used to funnel the malware through the individual pirate sites. So that level of sophistication backing the seemingly scattered and disunited front of piracy sites was an alarming development, and I think one of the biggest takeaways from this report. Yeah,
thanks so much. And Thom, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, who do you think falls victims to these types of attacks? Is it, is it just kind of the unsophisticated, you think of like my grandmother type person, maybe didn't know what she was doing, but she's probably not on a piracy site. Is it the kids who don't know what they're doing? Is it people who don't have ad blockers? Like who are the victims here, and what are the risks? You started to talk a little bit about this at the end, but what are the risks of leaving this unchecked?
Certainly there's going to be someone who's maybe perhaps a little bit more naive about technology, who might be more prone. But this is a volume business. You have 10 billion or so visits to piracy websites. You just have to get a small percentage of people to fall for it. People fall for lots of things who are sophisticated, whether it's getting hold of people's email passwords and things like that, or people send invoices to companies and hopefully someone doesn't realize it and they pay them. Happens all the time. So this is a volume business. If you can have enough visitors and put enough ads in front of them, if you can get just a small percentage, 2% say, you have a significant revenue source coming your way. So while I think you're more apt to see people who might be not as sophisticated with computers do that, I think almost anybody can fall for this along the way as they do it. In terms of what happens then, we know it's ransomware, we know there's identity theft, and this is just for individuals. If you work for a corporation and you have sensitive information and your computer is compromised, and remember this malware probes networks, not just computers, so it's about multiple, how many devices do you have in your home is essentially a question of what are they trying to access. If it's 15 or 20, then you're talking about a significant area they're trying to target. So it's, as I mentioned, financial issues in corporations. And I think the big worry for me now, honestly, is we see what North Korea is doing. We see what China's doing. We know what Russia's doing. We know they've tried to use our openness and our systems against us multiple times. I think that, to me, is what we should be focused on. I think there's a national security implication here, particularly when people work from home and then work on sensitive information. It becomes a game of Russian roulette, about piracy roulette, really, about whether or not someone's going to end up with access to their computer and being able to probe their network.
So Shane, I want to bring you in on this conversation. It strikes me that cybersecurity is continues to be this should be this top policy issue. It's a top priority issue, I think, for anyone working in IT. Yet when it comes to these policy debates, we're typically talking about Elon Musk and Twitter and targeted ads and privacy. So you've been in this field for a while. Is cybersecurity getting the attention it deserves in Washington? And if not, what needs to change? So
Thom's report points out that this is a $2 billion ecosystem. And you think about that.
I think you're fine.
That's not quite FTX, but it's close, right? So we have one guy who was supposed to be here yesterday, but he got in trouble and had to stay home under arrest. So it's a huge amount of money that is being spent by individuals in this area, and part of that is changing the paradigm of what we look at in the cybersecurity area. Securing your device is as important as securing the network. We used to think it was someone else's job, especially when most of the things that we did were on enterprise systems. A lot of people you mentioned went from an office configuration to a home office, and as the report points out, you have many points of presence in your house, and if you have someone who may not be the adult, but somebody else who's on a piracy site that is then clicked on this and now put the malware into a network system, it has the ability to affect the home system all the way back into the enterprise system. So it's a huge issue that we need to look at as our responsibility as individuals, not just the guy in the IT department who may not have sent out the most recent Patch Tuesday device. So users, consumer advocacy groups, I think it's great that the Senate is paying attention to this, because we need to look at this from the different angle, which is the individual consumers, not only the money they're losing, but the way that this is slipping into the system of individual users, and they need to be aware of it.
Yeah, and can I ask you maybe to stay on that for a moment? I mean, so we're seeing in Europe, for example, the Cyber Resilience Act, which is pushing for legislation that would, set security requirements for connected devices. Are you saying that you would like to see in the United States more aggressive legislation in terms of security requirements, or do you think there's other approaches?
So the challenge is always, where do you put the security? And I've done a lot of work on Internet of Things, and the challenge is the device manufacturers, depending on the device, don't necessarily want to be the one that's responsible for security because it's expensive. You add security in at the consumer level and it bumps the price up. And a lot of times the consumer doesn't completely understand how to activate the security on that. So that's that toggle point of like, do you put something into the device and then allow them to be able to utilize it? Is it an application on, application off, depending on where they come in? I think Europe is expecting a sophistication of users that I'm not sure is actually there, because like a lot of things, it shows up in the box. If it's application off, it's going to stay that way 80% of the time. People, probably most of us in the room, would know, or we might call somebody to help make sure that we have a layer of security in our network. We definitely, as individual users, expect our ISPs to take on a lot of that load, and I'm not even sure we know that. I know it because I play with, I'm a Comcast customer, so I love playing, to see how fast my system's going, what's going on. All that stuff is on your app, but I don't think the individual user knows that they can put those protections in place. So sometimes you need that ISP level to be protecting the network. As Thom pointed out, when you're in a residential environment, you're in what they might call like a hoteling situation, where I'm jumping on and off my IP system. I was on my Wi-Fi right before I came up here, and then as soon as I drop that number, one of my neighbors might pick it up. So that's also a challenge on the criminal intent, is not always knowing exactly within an time range who was actually committing the crime at the time, if there was a crime being committed, or that these guys they're coming into the system and they realize they've got an opportunity for a lot of people and are in an area that just their security is off. So yes, the IoT challenge is a definite challenge.
So, Shaun, I wanted to go back to you. I mean, one of the things that struck me in your remarks, you talked about how sophisticated these ad networks were. And when you look at this volume, right? I mean, criminal activity on this scale doesn't happen with just a few bad actors. It's because they're able to use lots of different platforms, whether it's domain registrars, hosting services, ad networks that are turning the other cheek on this kind of thing. So whether they're doing it wittingly or unwittingly, there's a lot of other stakeholders involved. So my question to you is, what more do you think these different stakeholders should be doing to address piracy and address cybersecurity risks? As Shane was just talking about, ISPs maybe have a role. Where do you see as the good touch points for influencing this?
Well, first of all, I'd say that these ad networks that are distributing malvertising, pushing ads that have malware, contained in them or associated with them, they're definitely doing it knowingly. Because, for example, Propeller Ads, which was one of the sites that we investigated, actually provides guides on how to submit deceptive ads without breaking specific rules. Interestingly, one of the rules that they push forward is you're not allowed to disparage the Russian government or paint them in a negative light. And we've actually seen many of these sites based out of Cyprus, which is a common destination for Russian expats. So I think, actually preventing these sites from operating on American internet sites, or even sites that are accessible to the average consumers who are actually going and visiting piracy sites, cracking down on those companies like Propeller Ads who actually present themselves as a legitimate advertising company, and saying that they're pushing malware, and we need to actually crack down and stop them from distributing that malware at a large scale.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thom, I wanted to kind of follow up with you a similar question. What's your message to the advertising industry? It seems that, obviously most of the ad industry isn't serving up malicious ads, but how do they, weed out those bad apples?
Sure. To Shaun's point, you have those in the industry who are trying to live in two worlds. They're trying to live in a legitimate ad ecosystem, and then they are having no trouble participating in a nefarious, illicit, and sometimes illegal system, which is essentially peddling ads that are filled with malware. So if you're the ad industry, I think it gets down to the company you keep. Are you comfortable that these folks are associated with you? We found two entities, Shaun found two entities, particularly that we focused on, Propeller Ads and
Rich Ads.
Rich Ads. And one of the Rich Ads was the one that you all presented that ad to see how they would react, and they had no trouble with it. And the reason they had no trouble with it is because on their website it actually gives a case study exactly like that. So they were actually promoting this. It wasn't just a one-off. It's actually on their website. So I think fundamentally the ad ecosystem has to decide whether or not they're comfortable having these people with them if they're going to behave this way. And I think that's a reckoning that the ad industry has to consider, because they can't have it both ways. You can't associate with illicit and notorious actors and then expect to have trust in the ad ecosystem. You can't have it both ways.
And Thom, let me just stay with you for a minute. Also on I think it's so important that we've done a lot of work on piracy, and piracy isn't these piracy sites. I think when people I think back in the day, right, there was this peer-to-peer file sharing. So the idea was, it's just some kids sharing videos with their friends, and maybe at one point there was some of that, but now with these streaming sites, it's clear it's not. It's not just some kids sharing movies with their friends. These are, basically criminal enterprises that are operating a for-profit criminal enterprise that's very lucrative. And so, stopping that seems like a part of that has to be going after this incentive structure.
Yeah.
It should not be financially viable. So how do you address that?
Yeah, so if you think about the characteristics of kids in the basement ripping CDs, they don't engage in the dark web on negotiations with hackers for what it would cost to do 1,000 installs. And our investigators have found that on the dark web, where pirates and hackers are negotiating just exactly how much they'll get paid to infect their users. So you don't expect that. That's a indication of a criminal enterprise. Two, in previous research, we had, on some of these streaming apps, we had an instance where we downloaded the app, it immediately took our password and credentials and shipped it to a server in Indonesia, and then took about a terabyte of data that was in a honey trap situation, which is a lab environment to see if they take it. So that's not a characteristic of kids in a basement. That's a characteristic of a criminal enterprise. So we have to call it what it is, which is these are criminal enterprises running, as Shane points out, a remarkable sized industry of over $2 billion. And they have business plans and alliances and partnerships just like any other business. This just happens to be illegal and nefarious. So I think we have to treat them as such.
So Shane, addressing cybersecurity and piracy in the past has often involved collaborating with global allies. So how do you think the U.S. should be engaging with foreign partners? Do you think there's a role for this to be, these to be issues brought up in the US-EU Trade and Technology Council? Do you think there's other forums where this should be brought up? Where do you think the Biden administration maybe could take this in the next 2 years?
So I think part of that is, I'm sorry, this is Mike. I think part of that challenge is that, because it did start off with, let's say, the kids in the basement, it felt like it was a victimless crime. And so you didn't have people in law enforcement, you didn't have the advocacy groups saying, we're seeing the criminal intent here, and they were going after it in the Department of Justice. But since then, we have seen, we've seen all the crypto that has come on board and how heavily that is used, especially on the dark web. The Alpha Bay situation, where we saw so much cooperation that came on trying to, shut down the most recent, huge dark web network that involved actually a global entity. We had the FBI, we had varying entities within the United States. We started to bring in Europe. Actually, the Netherlands was very involved in that process because they were in the middle of trying to take down a German dark web program. And then we had Malaysia engaged because that's where the person who is running Alpha Bay ended up being residing, and bringing him into the fold. So it it took a lot of people, and the laws still are not completely up to speed. And when they think it's just a bunch of script kiddies, or I mean, you're starting off with people that are using an illegal product to begin with, and then they're getting scammed by ad guys that no one really feels very bad for them, but yet there's a criminal intent that is much larger than the initial money entity. It is actually taking over the networks, and that's where I think we need to see much more cyber criminal experts come into this space, because it is becoming, as Tom's pointed out, it's the national, the Chinese and the Russians, and a lot of the other people that are in this space. We realize that there's a lot of harm that is way beyond just the individual getting scammed by the ad, but that's where it starts.
So, one of the things that strikes me is that, there was a common, refrain you hear in anti-piracy in the last, I guess since the kind of SOPA PIPA debates, was follow the money, right? Everyone was saying follow the money. And the point was, if we can stop the flow of money, that will help address the problem. But one of the things I think is so interesting about this report, as Shane, you just mentioned too, was that, this money is, the question now is where is this money flowing to on this other side? Where is all, that these advertisers are getting? So I guess my question, and maybe Shaun, you can start with this, and Thom, if you have something to add on this as well, given that China and Russia are behind so much malware, I mean, we know that, what do you suspect their potential involvement might be in some of these piracy sites or the malware on the piracy sites? Are we concerned about, US dollars basically flowing to fund these types of problematic activities?
That's, I don't have concrete evidence of bank transfers going into Russia or anything like that, but can definitely speak to the relationship of, companies that are effectively Russian or heavily associated with Russia, actually operating the core infrastructure that's funding pirate sites, and ostensibly profiting from that activity. So, for example, let's say I'm a kid in a basement and I want to start up a piracy site. I'm going to make money off of it, I'm going to contact a service that hosts a bunch of pirated videos. So that's going to be typically a video player that is embedded on my site. And then I'm also going to connect with an ad network and offer to display their ads on my site. So that'll be my sources of income for my piracy site there. But what those video players do, when you click on it, it immediately hits you with an ad or pops up a redirect, prompts you to install something, and then may eventually let you watch the movie for a couple minutes before you get hit by something else. And those ads have a high chance of redirecting you to adware, malware, or other not particularly above board services, so like gambling. So those core infrastructure pieces that support the rest of the pirate sites, that video distribution network, the ad distribution network, those are the things that we see tied back to propeller ads, rich ads, Russian, dominated companies that may be bringing money into that country. And this is actually, so a couple weeks ago, there was actually a report on Reuters about a bunch of apps in the Google and Apple store having push whoosh, which is very similar content distribution, ad distribution software, which is associated with a Russian company, just prevalent throughout the App Store environment. So you're seeing like these operations not only in pirate sites, but really operating at a large scale throughout a lot of the tech environment. So.
Thanks. I mean, I think that's one reason I know in our work we've been very interested in these questions about, the extent to which, the Google and Apple can exercise control over their app stores, because if they can't block, sites that are, or apps that are, using malicious ad networks, that really opens the door to a lot of problematic content. Thom?
Yeah, I'd say that's true, and just to put it a little broader, 2 years ago, Congress passed legislation that gave law enforcement more tools to be able to go target pirates who were in the digital streaming world. There was a bit of a loophole in the law, and they changed the law. And appreciate the fact that I think law enforcement takes that seriously, and I think the extent that they can do more there will help with the issue, which is going after folks who are doing this.
This was the law where people were concerned they were going to arrest Justin Bieber. Was that one?
I don't know, but show of hands, who's for that? So then there's the question of enablers, and it's a tricky world. We have to understand that the enablers, the people who do these things, deal with a large volume. I don't think you blame someone for being abused once or even twice, but on the 2,000th or 2 millionth time, I think you can question their sincerity. I'll give you an example. Several years ago, we did a report that looked at cyber lockers, which were a way in which to transfer piracy. One of these cyber lockers used MasterCard. So we went to MasterCard and said, here's a challenge. Here's 12 instances in which it's being used. They said, well, this is needles in a haystack. I said, I agree. It's hard for you to find the needles. We'll find them for you. We'll give you the needles. Will you do something? And they said, no. So that was an instance where, on another instance, different issue, Visa was presented with essentially work we do, because we do a lot of work looking at the illegal sale of drugs, where we went to Visa on an issue dealing with a very sleepy pharmacy in Pittsburgh that was a fulcrum or a conduit for lots of different online sites that were illegally selling drugs. And we went to Visa, and boom, they stopped doing business with them because they were presented with information and they did a very responsible thing. So I think you have a lot instances that if we look at it and go, if law enforcement takes it seriously, and we appreciate the work they've done, if you have the enablers, once they're presented with information, can do a better job. And it's also up to the users that we have to understand the implications of what we do. And some of that is they just don't know it, so we have to do a better job of educating them. But if you look at those three entities, if law enforcement steps up what it does, if the enablers of this do a better job of taking a responsible role, and users are educated, I think we can do a lot towards making sure that the user's not abused and that we don't end up with as much ransomware and everything else that stems from piracy.
I want to open it up to audience questions in just a moment, but Shaun, I wanted to go with you just to kind of maybe not conclude the panel, but as we're, this congressional session is almost over. There's obviously going to be another one right around the corner. As members of Congress are thinking about legislative options and priorities, around cybersecurity and IP protection, are there things that you think they should be focused on?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say I'm very excited that we've seen the Department of Homeland Security and CISA really become more of a partner with enterprises and companies. That was always a challenge, was where the government stopped and their responsibility stopped, and when they started helping citizens at a different level that wasn't just government. So that is great. They have, to your previous point, said, they are very suspect of putting any apps on government, government devices, and because they realize the problems with it. And it is a lot of what is being pointed out today. A lot of it is unsavory things that will get into the network. So the idea that we have this legislation currently up that says that we should put our guard down rather than our guard up around applications. One of the great things about apps is that it is learned from websites. Websites have a different way of being managed because the technology is different. The device entity allows you to have another layer of protection. Bringing that guard down on that protection layer is definitely a challenge.
Perfect timing. Thanks so much. We just wrapped up our panel discussion, and we said, we're really wondering what Congress is going to do next. So it's my pleasure to welcome Senator Tillis here today to join us in this discussion. I know you had a short amount of time, so I'll just turn over the floor to you right away.
It's very endearing for my staff to put together a speech that I very seldom read, and I'm going to keep the streak alive. Thank you all for being here. Thom Tillis from North Carolina. About 3 Congresses ago, we decided that we just weren't making progress on intellectual property in the big committee and that we needed a focus, and that's why we stood up the Intellectual Property Subcommittee, which I chaired at that time. We were in the majority. And since then, I think we've done extraordinary work. And we've got a lot more on the plate. I know if you all track this space, you know some of the bills that we have passed, but we've still got piracy issues, the criminal element. Felony streamers are smart, so we're going to have to constantly play this game to stay ahead of it. We did have Brad Watts on my team, who recently left. We're going to miss him, but he's worked with us to identify various candidates. So I think when we get into Congress next year, we won't miss a beat. I do think our office, the problem that you have with changing what exists today, a little bit less so in, say, copyrights than in patents, but there's always stakeholder groups that are for change and against change. And one methodology that I feel strongly about that can sometimes put stakeholders, even like you all in the room, at ease is we'll drop a discussion document that scares everybody. Because sometimes that's the only way you can get everybody to the table. And we're going to use that same methodology next year. I believe that Chris Coons will be the chair. I'll be the ranking member. And we will continue to press, continue to have work groups. I think committees are good, but I think work groups let you accelerate the work that ultimately needs to come before a formal committee. And we're going to continue to ask for your engagement and your ideas. And collaborative engagement. And that's why I think we have produced so many policies that many people thought couldn't ultimately get signed by the president by just using that iteration, that iterative cycle. The one thing I'd tell you is we've also got to, we're really trying to eliminate a lot of the problems that exist today to make sure creators are able to, are incented to and continue to create at a pace that I hope is even accelerated over time. But then we have to look ahead and see what other kinds of interesting issues we're going to run into. How many of y'all have gone online to, Chat GPT? Well, I enrolled in it the second day it was available to the public, and I've had it write me a few haikus, several essays, for and against a certain subject. And it's extraordinary. It's in its infancy, but you see a time when we're going to have to start talking about who owns that content and how do we address something that was science fiction 10 years ago, conceptually. I've been working in artificial intelligence since the late 80s when it really started taking root up in Boston. But we've got a lot of, as we focus on the problems that we need to solve today, we need to work even further to anticipate the problems of the future so that we're not fixing things after they have done damage. And that'll be something that we'll, I think, better structure our thinking around. But if you haven't gone on Chat GPT, as I was going to the chamber yesterday, I was with my press secretary, and I asked Chat GPT, what now is the value of a press secretary? But these are the sorts of things we get to talk about that are looking ahead to future challenges. But thank you all for coming. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be here more. I've got to go back to the Hill for a Republican conference meeting. But I appreciate you being here because generally speaking, I don't think any of the good ideas that have passed in the law necessarily came out of the minds of me, or certainly not out of my mind, but out of the staff's minds. It was because of the engagement. People like Peter, I call him Juice, that's his nickname, y'all can call him that, Peter Pappas, Cirillo, Seth, and previously Brad Watts. It's because we continue to engage with you all and you say something that we think makes what we're attempting to do better. So thank you for the dialogue, thank you for contributing your expertise, and thank you in advance for engaging in what I think is going to be another very productive Congress. Thank you all.
Thanks again. Thanks so much for that. And I think that really kind of recaps, why we think this is so important and how there's so many opportunities to do more work in this space. So we have a few more minutes left. As I said, I'll open it up to any questions in the room or online. Again, if you're submitting questions online, we'll get them up here. please. And if you want, you can come up or you can just shout it out loudly and I'll repeat it. So can you repeat the question for us?
Sure. The question is, what is a piracy site? And the questioner raises the point that she finds some of her pictures on her own website get taken. I'll answer the first part first, if that's okay. So we look at a piracy site and really a piracy platform because we've moved not just from websites but to apps, right? It's a common thing in terms of the transition. As an entity that is offering up effectively movies, TV shows, games, sometimes music that does not belong to them. And they are making money off of that, typically about a 90 to 95% margin, because it's easy to make a lot of profit if you don't pay for the content, right? So typically we look at it as both websites, and of course we've watched websites become apps, so piracy follows exactly the technology evolution that everything else does. So typically it's a place that is offering those, and typically they're offering them in a subscription model, maybe $10 to $15 a month, or they're offering it in an advertising model where you have to see ads to be able to watch that content. I think what you're talking about, though, is also very important, which is essentially a question of content respect. And it's an increasing issue because more and more of us are creators. We express ourselves online with our pictures, or we do our own creative work online across the digital platforms that exist. And if we don't create a culture of respect, then that is troublesome because it makes it a lot easier for people to kind of reconcile why they should do things either that are selfish or illegal. So I actually very much agree with what you're saying there. I'd love to talk to you afterwards about that because I think we do have to create not just in piracy, traditional piracy as it's kind of defined, but this issue of content respect as more and more of us express ourselves online.
I'd also like to add on that in legislation, I think this issue has come up quite a bit where there's been a real effort to distinguish between a site that might have incidental copyright infringement versus a site that is substantively engaged in piracy. So that's come up a lot in the context of how do you draw a line so that, you know, if somebody does post a photo that they shouldn't, you could still go after them for copyright infringement, but we're not trying to loop them under another law. That's true. Other questions?
So I'm a huge believer in transparency, accountability, and if I can get it, auditability. So the idea that you need to be very transparent and clear with the consumer what it is that you're doing with the information flow there. So you got to two things there. Part of it is that you might be getting into a subscription model that you didn't realize that you had to unclick the box, right? The other one is what is happening to the data that is being collected about you, and where does it go? First party, the first initial entity, I would think that should be much more clear. And then the challenge after that is when it's sold from that first party to the third party and you are unaware of that as a consumer. Those are things that have been recommended. It's legislation that is both in the House and the Senate right now. We're probably going to push it into the next next year's Congress, but the idea of wanting consumers to be much more aware and show that awareness on the websites, as we really are in a digital economy now, and people are used to getting this information. It should be clear what your agreement is in the terms of use and terms of service, not a 36-page something you have to scroll through and you have to unclick the accept button. We've definitely seen, the migration of how businesses are managing information because of the European law. The reason why that's working in Europe and American companies are paying attention is that the fine is real. It's it's a very large fine if they get caught not obeying the rules on a European consumer. And so we'd like to have similar guidance here in the United States. It isn't that we don't have privacy laws in the United States. We have very strong privacy laws in certain sectors like finance and healthcare. We don't have it necessarily in retail and those things that are managed forward. So I think having better consumer protections around that are very important. Congress has taken some great steps forward. They just haven't gotten it past the finish line.
Yes, please.
Hi there. So some of y'all have mentioned ad networks' role in this issue. So I'm curious, when it comes to transparency within those ad networks, it's really murky. Just seeing which sites they fund. I mean, when it comes to propeller ads or rich ads, there's some efforts at addressing that, such as ads.txt and sellers.json. I'm curious what additional kinds of measures are needed in order to get a better understanding of this. And in your research process, have you found frustrating roadblocks to understand this better?
Shaun, do you want to start, and then Thom, maybe?
Sure. So for the ad networks that are attempting to actually combat malvertising, better vetting would absolutely be a good first step. So for those malicious ads that do sneak through to Google AdSense, for example, just more stringent requirements on the sources of those ads and then the actual content that ends up getting displayed to users. But I would say that the propeller ads, rich ads, they're doing it intentionally, absolutely. So again, they have guides on their site, like FAQs, and then pages and pages and pages on how to maximize the effectiveness of your scare tactic, or how to fly under this particular filter, how to not get your ad flagged by recognition, things like that. So though that is a totally separate problem of actually having them stop that practice in the first place, of not just letting it slip through, but actively supporting it and enabling it.
I think this is wrapping it up. So one thing, though, that Shaun's being humble about is the work they did to really look at these ad networks. It was unprecedented and remarkable the way you were able to really explore this and see how they operated. So it's really worthwhile just going back to the report to see the work that Shaun and his team did. Taking a bigger step, just advertising and everything else, is we need a sustained commitment. This is just not we've all lived in communities where suddenly, obviously, someone complains about speed, and then there's a cop there for 2 weeks, and they kind of make their point and they move on. It doesn't really slow things down just for a little bit of time. It's a show. So we need a sustained commitment to ensure that criminals don't use piracy as a means to undermine lots of things we do. I think this fits, piracy sometimes and privacy fit neatly together, because ultimately if your data is being misused or taken without your knowledge, it happens in both instances. So we need a sustained commitment. Rob Harrelson created an amazing group several years ago that really tried to look at the trust in ads. But we need a sustained commitment from those who say they care about this to continue to do it. And I think if I have any message in here, this is, we can't be the cop who sits at a corner for 2 weeks and says, job done. Because this is a $2 billion industry with very motivated and clever criminals. And we now have it where they have used piracy as a means to essentially people who wish us harm in terms of jihad and other things to be able to broadcast in the United States. It allows for a lot of, allows law enforcement to be thwarted, and it now presents other types of national security and law enforcement issues, as well as issues just for consumers. So if we don't take it seriously and in a sustained commitment, we won't be able to solve that.
Well, thanks to all of you for being here today and for the questions. Thanks to our panelists and thanks to Senator Tillis for his involvement. I agree this is something that we've obviously been working on for a long time. I think there's a lot more progress we need to see. It's good to see some of this progress, and I also echo the fact that Senator Tillis has been leading on things like the Smart Copyright Act, which I think is one way to start addressing some of these new problems that are cropping up. So I'm sure we'll be talking about more of this in the coming year. Thank you.